Hello, hi, a very warm welcome to First Light Spotlight, Parallel Histories. I'm writer, critic and editor Laura Robertson, and I'll be your host this evening. This is one of several Spotlight talks expanding on the inaugural First Light project, which celebrates Northern graduates of 2020. Created by Waterside Trafford and Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool, the First Light exhibition and publication will launch at Castlefield Gallery's new art spaces in Warrington on 22nd of May. Exciting. First Light aims to reflect the diversity of photography now as practiced today, at a time when, given the circumstances, we might all be reimagining our futures. Tonight, we'll be talking about photo montage series The Gay Times, which uses fictional storytelling and real archival imagery to highlight the discrimination of sexuality in 1970s Britain. Before I introduce our speakers, just a bit of housekeeping, as usual. We've enabled the chat function and Q&A box, so please do ask questions or comment throughout the event. This is a safe space and we ask that you're respectful to us and all other attendees. Thank you for joining us. My guests tonight, Nathan Johnson. Hi, Nathan. Graduated from BA Photography, University of Central Lancashire, or UCLan as I'll call it from now on, in 2020. He enjoys incorporating historical elements within his work that investigate the social and political inequalities facing oppressed communities. While being heavily influenced by photo montage techniques, he merges both found and archived imagery with his own to create thought-provoking narratives that challenge our perspectives on society. Jack Ryder. Hi, Jack.
You okay?
Hiya. Graduated from BA Creative Writing at Liverpool John Moores University last year also, and is a Liverpool-based writer whose work aims to shine a light onto situations of social injustice. He also acts and would like to write for film and TV. And finally, Brian Morrison. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Laura, you all right?
Is an artist and lecturer in photography at UCLan. Using materials and physical processes connected to the human body, his art practice explores how we interpret the world through a gendered perspective. Most recently, Brian has been researching masculine and feminine attributes as used by ancient spiritual practices. Absolutely loads to dig into tonight. Welcome, all of you. I'd like to congratulate you, Nathan, first on graduating during lockdown. How was it? You have to come off mute, Nathan.
Yeah.
There you are. Hiya.
Hi.
So how was it graduating during lockdown?
Yeah, it was a lot different than I expected it to be. Obviously with COVID, it wasn't a face-to-face graduation. There wasn't an end of year show. Typically it would be a physical exhibition, but that never happened. And yeah, it was very different. And obviously this kind of had an impact on my own work. So I'm glad it kind of turned out in a way where I was able to at least show my work. So that was really good.
Of course, and we'll see your work in the First Light exhibition, of course, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But before lockdown, you managed to do a lot of research in your local archives, and I'd love to start with that. So could you tell us a little bit about the archives, first and foremost?
Yeah, so the archives I went to were the Lancashire archives, which are based in Preston, which are very local to me, so that was really easy. And it all kind of began in the summer of 2019, and it was just in between my second and final year doing my BA, and it was also the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in America, so that made me kind of think about history, gay history in the UK. Obviously we hear a lot about American gay history, but we don't really hear much about it in the UK at all. So that kind of made me interested in that. And yeah, it just started with me going to my local library. I got my first ever library card for the first time. and that was really interesting.
Second,
And
congratulations is in order. Your first library card.
yeah,
Brilliant.
yeah,
Did
so
it
it was
open up?
interesting.
Did it just open up a completely different type of research for you then, that you're already, of course, experienced at university?
Yeah, yeah, it did. It was completely eye-opening, and it opened up a lot of doors, obviously, for this project that I worked on. It was really beneficial. And yeah, it was kind of just inspired by my kind of interest in history, and especially gay history. And it just kind of stemmed from there, really. And I started by, skimming through old newspaper articles on microfilm in the library, and I found it really interesting looking back at how homosexuality was portrayed in the media during that time, especially during a time when it wasn't socially acceptable. I found that really interesting. Obviously, well, we all know there was a very negative representation of gay people during that time. The language that was used was obviously very critical and very harsh and just degrading. You couldn't really imagine it now, but it just made
Things
me
only
think about that.
things only started to change in law in the 1960s, didn't they? And this is
Yeah.
living memory, living history. But you're a very young person as well, so I'm really
Mm.
interested in kind of recent events that switched
Yeah.
on to looking back into this history. And I know you mentioned straight pride marches in the
Mm.
US. What were your
Yeah.
thoughts when you saw those news items as a photographer and an artist?
Yeah. So obviously, it was during a time when Donald Trump was still president in the United States, and there was a lot of backlash against the LGBT community by the right wing press and things like that. And yeah, it was just kind of difficult to understand, really. Why would someone want that kind of celebration when you already have those kind of equal rights and opportunities that obviously gay people didn't have? And that kind of made me think, well, it's just a conversation that could be had. Why is it there in the first place? Why is pride even existing? What made it begin? And it just made me think, well, heterosexual people don't have to go through what we went through as a community to have that celebration. So yeah, it kind of came down to that.
And inspired this brilliant topsy-turvy world view
Yeah.
that you can see behind me here. And these fictional newspaper headlines, right, based on
Yeah.
real newspapers, real news articles, real opinions that you dug out in the archive. Like, how difficult, first of all, was it to source the old newspapers and images that you needed to look at?
Well, it was kind of difficult to begin with. Obviously, originally I never had any kind of experience in an archive before, especially being a student. I kind of had this perception where there'll be a lot of experienced older people there who know everything about what they're doing, and I would just be completely clueless.
It's really, really challenging to work in an archive. You've got so
Yeah.
much stuff, haven't you? This is based
Yeah.
on my own experience. You don't even know where to start looking at first, and then you have to spend a lot of time, don't you, digging
Yeah.
through, playing a bit of a detective role.
Yeah, it is. It was very difficult to begin with. Obviously, the kind of source material I was looking for, it was obviously really helpful, but it wasn't exactly what I needed in that time. So the archives very kindly directed me towards more online archives where I was able to take images and use for that purpose. So yeah, it is based on real life events that have happened to the gay community. For example, it references Section 28 and gay marriage, the whole discussion around that, and obviously the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. It's all kind of referenced in there in some bizarre way. And yeah, it's all based on, it's loosely based on the past and what's this weird community have gone through.
How did you take this approach, when did you first decide to kind of switch things around and, you know, think about the world, what it would be like if the opposite were true?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned before, I'm very interested. I've always been interested in dystopian novels, you know, like 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale,
Yes.
and those kind of scenarios where the author's, you know, social and political views influence these kind of alternative universes, which I found really interesting and thought-provoking, and just how free they were able to express themselves with those views. And my kind of whole scenario is based on the kind of homophobic fears that are played on towards gay people. You know, there's always this talk of what the world is coming to because LGBT people are gaining more acceptance. So it kind of plays on those fears of the right-wing media, especially.
It's really effective in that way, you know, the way you've manipulated the photography, you know, people holding straight pride banners, treatment for heterosexuals, backlash over ban, members of straight liberation groups gathering. It's all very believable because it's already happened. It's just that you've
Yeah.
changed the players round, right?
Yeah, it is. It's all based, like I said, based on what happened to the gay community, really. And it was just my whole kind of thought process of kind of turning it on its head and, you know, stripping away the dominant kind of community of their kind of social and political rights and kind of make them see through their own eyes, you know, what it would be like to experience that kind of hatred and discrimination. And obviously, I believe that people relate more to experiences that affect them personally. So I thought by, you know, having those kind of experiences laid out before them, it might open up a discussion that people don't really want to have about their own biases and thoughts on society.
It definitely does that. I think that subjective viewpoint is really, really important to talk about. I'll bring Jack in at this point, actually. Hi, Jack. Great to have you here. I just want to talk about the text that you've written in response to Nathan's photographs, actually, because it's almost like a script dialogue, isn't it? Reflecting your interests in TV and film, like we mentioned before. But tell me about how you first had the idea that you eventually decided on, you know, to respond in this way to Nathan's imagery.
Yeah, so I think in general, my work generally takes quite a colloquial tone just because of probably like the media that I absorb is quite conversational. But Nathan's work kind of inspired this idea where obviously he flips the table with what the norm is, but he does that in quite a wide scale in his work, which I really liked. But I thought, you know, for a piece of writing, it would work better like shrunk down onto a smaller scale. So I wanted this sort of second person narrative where people sort of imagine themselves in that situation. And I think, I mean, as Nathan was saying to me when I interviewed him, he was like, oh, people are more empathetic about a certain situation if they can imagine themselves in that situation.
Yes.
So I wanted to kind of flip the table and for people to kind of, you know, people that have experienced like a similar like life to me and Nathan would read it, and because of the colloquial language, they might be like find it quite accessible and like familiar. And then people that don't, on the other hand, imagine they put themselves in someone else's shoes, and it's just interesting like both ways, I think.
And that's really difficult to achieve as a writer. So I applaud you for the text, which we'll hear later, which you're going to be reading live for us. I'm really excited about that. But yeah, it's very relatable and it absolutely allows the reader or the listener to step into somebody else's shoes for a moment. And that's such a powerful way to kind of change people's perspectives, right? I think it's, you must have been thinking when you first interviewed Nathan and looked at his work, you know, how to talk about politics now, how to reimagine history and keep it discussed as something relevant and important now that's not nothing's been solved. There's still discrimination,
Mhm.
right? Is it very difficult as a writer to kind of bring history alive?
Yeah, and I think that's probably why I make so many like pop culture references in it. As I said, like the kind of media I absorb, they make a lot of pop culture references, like but you know, I think it was, you know, I mentioned things like Bratz and Grinder, and it kind of puts it in a time capsule. So it just, people reading that, like maybe like 90s babies or 2000s babies, like people who grew up at a similar time to me and Nathan, will read that and go, oh, this was a part of my life. And it kind of like, hopefully, like, you know, when you mention things that are quite current, like like in 100 years, someone might read that and be like, oh, so this is what it was like in that time. And that was the political situation. And so yeah, that's sort of the way I wanted to go with it.
Do you think studying creative writing at LJMU prepared you for this commission?
Yeah, I think yeah, I would definitely say that it did prepare me. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the lectures we had, they had experience in so many different things. Like I had a teacher that used to write for Emmerdale. Like they all like have like their own novels and things. So I think, you know, they're all like, they're not just lecturers, you know, they have their own sort of writing careers outside of that. And that's what people don't really know when they go to uni, that their lecturers actually have like a massive catalogue of work outside of that.
Well, that's the hope, isn't it, when you go to study at
Mhm.
undergraduate level, certainly at MA
In general.
level. Yeah, and you did, working with people who have a current, exciting, timely practice, that's infectious, isn't it? And you also graduated during lockdown last year, Jack, and I'm just wondering how it's been for you, really finding your feet, finding any kind of, you know, first steps on the ladder.
Yeah, I mean, it was like a weird limbo state. Like I'm sure it was for everyone for like a good like 3 to 6 months. I did find an internship that was actually like in Sicily, which was just writing for like a tourism, like a tourism company basically.
Mm.
And that was a really good time. I didn't expect that to actually happen though, because it was 6 months of literally like, oh my God, what is going on? But
It
finally I
still
got
feels
that.
like that now.
And now it's kind of gone back to that now, to be honest, because it's just like a few bits here and there, but generally just like a normal job and like writing on the side. But I think it's working for now, so I'm happy.
And in terms of peer group, obviously, you know, part of the First Light project, a really important part, was to introduce you to new people, build these kind of new, small, connected peer groups. How was it meeting Nathan, discussing shared interests and interviewing him and kind of building this relationship where you've now created your own piece of creative writing?
I think it was a very easy sort of interviewing process, because I mean, like from like straight away, Nathan wasn't scared to just give me all of the details of like what his creative process was. And I think we just kind of generally agreed on the way we wanted to go with like both of our work and how they sort of related. And I think we cover similar topics anyway in our work, just because we have a lot of shared experiences. Um, so I think it just works in that way because of our shared experiences.
I'm going to bring in a tutor now, since we've been talking about tutors having an exciting artistic practice. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. And you're Nathan's tutor at the moment on an MA, photography MA at UCLan, is that right?
No.
No.
So I don't teach him now, but I did teach him whenever he was completing this project. And
You were Nathan's BA tutor.
I'm the BA tutor.
I thought you were still with him, Brian.
No, unfortunately not. I wish.
And I'm interested in this relationship between the real and imagined in Nathan's work. I just wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that, about what you think the real and imagined does in the context of Nathan's work, and indeed photography work that pushes political ideas or concepts or boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, what I really loved about what Nathan was doing whenever, you know, he first came to me with this idea was that with photography, you're always questioning some form of truth. You know, there's this idea that photography has a truth to it, and that isn't always the case. And in fact, something that can look very truthful as a photograph, you know, a very straight documentary photograph of something, has a kind of perceived amount of truth attached to it. And we assume that there is truth attached to this through photography, but that's very rarely the case. There's all sorts of rhymes and reasons why what we're looking at may or may not be true. And even determining what the idea of truth might be is different for different people. So what I really loved about Nathan's work was the idea that he was making this very deliberate and clearly, you know, untruth, connecting it to photography, this real sort of humorous, satirical approach to questioning the idea of truth in photography. And I just love that idea of that kind of when we're confronted with something that seems ridiculous, we have to ask the question, well, why is it ridiculous? And then suddenly we're taken into the fact that, well, it's only ridiculous because we have this set of ideologies or belief systems that have been given to us through all different sorts of ways. And often those ideologies are given to us through the media, which Nathan is also critiquing in the way in which he presents his work, which is in these newspaper headlines and these newspaper articles that he's put together. So as the work developed across the time that we spent together, you started to see all of these interconnected kind of critiques and questioning start to evolve. Everything from the nature of photography through to obviously the social question and the struggles and the political questions that we see in his work, and done in a way that really makes you question the kind of normative narrative that we see so often, the normative narrative, and the position that quite often newspapers take and the media take, and questioning that idea of well, how do we draw upon the opinions that we make? You know, the very basis of, well, why do we think the way that we think? And I think that's a really fascinating component of really of anyone that is using or exploring the idea of truth, but specifically in what Nathan was doing in relation to, you know, the history of sexuality and oppression and all those sorts of things.
What's the difference between playing with truth and playing with fact? You know, you mentioned satire here.
I don't know if there is a difference really. I think the difference between fact and truth is always about the you know, the interpretation of it. You know, facts. I mean, what is a fact? Is it, you know, what do we determine a fact to be? Something that has a you know, an evidence-based thing. Well, how do we capture that evidence? I think that if you want to, you can start to really drill into the, you know, what is a truth and what is a fact. And when it comes to making art, I don't know if facts are that helpful, actually. There's a great quote from Werner Herzog, the German filmmaker, who says if truth was important in filmmaking, the phone book would be the most, you know, perfect written book. You know, it was like this thing. The phone book just says what it is. There's nothing else about it. But actually, that's not really an important thing whenever we're trying to be creative or work in creative ways. So I don't know if there is a difference really between fact and truth. Perhaps it's terminology, perhaps it's interpretation.
It's that switcheroo, isn't it, that Nathan mentioned before about highlighting or exposing bias. It's that gut punch of immediately knowing your own prejudices and ignorance when you look at Nathan's work, just from that simple character switch, which is so powerful. And it's hard, isn't it? It's really hard to play around with humor in your work as an artist. It's incredibly hard to like walk that line and make work that immediately communicates to an audience exactly what you're trying to get across.
Yeah, I think it's the most difficult thing in terms of whenever, if you decide on a kind of genre, because you're up against the barrier of not being taken seriously. If you look at, you know, comedy films or even sort of comedic music, it's often not taken seriously for its artistic endeavors. It's often like, oh yeah, it was a good comedy film, but it's never going to get nominated for an Oscar. You know, there has to be a seriousness to it. So so taking on the challenge of comedy for any creative who's also trying to make a serious point is, I think, the kind of most difficult thing to do. But often, I don't know, you guys are probably too young to remember things like The Day Today, which was a play on kind of the way that media reports the news, but it was this incredibly Brass Eye and The Day Today, these two kind of comedy shows from the 90s, which satirized the idea of kind of mainstream news media in a really hilarious way. But again, that same idea of sort of showing you the ridiculousness of what you think. It's just because this thing is ridiculous. Well, if you look at it in a different light, it's, well, you also think things that are ridiculous. And I think that is a really powerful thing with comedy and satire, but it is so hard to get right and to navigate that immediate dismissal that someone might have. Oh, it's just a joke, and that's not serious, that's not important, you know. And I genuinely think that Nathan achieves that.
Well, when you were working with Nathan at university, you were looking at Linda, Barbara Kruger, artists that use the language, right, of the media to broadcast other messages. I wonder how important those artists have been in your teaching, like more broadly, and what that media approach has to offer, really.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some people there, and they're kind of I suppose art heroes of mine, really. You know, especially Linda.
Me too.
Yeah. I mean, and I think for me, it was, I discovered those guys whenever I was studying, and I was, I guess, learning about the feminist art movement, both, you know, and sort of feminism, second wave feminism, really, the 70s movement. I started to become interested in that and what was happening there, specifically across not just specifically in image-based art practices, but through sculpture and performance and all these different ways that the feminist art movements were making kind of political and, you know, social comments using their art practice, which was obviously a thing that was starting to happen at that time. And I suddenly became aware of just how powerful art could be whenever I discovered those folks. So they've always been a significant part in my own practice. When I'm making my own art, I often reference back to the things that they were doing, and likewise, they tend to come up in the teaching that I offer, and especially whenever you're dealing with issues connected to gender, issues connected to sexuality. You know, you have, personally speaking, you have to go back to that history. That's such a significant point in gender politics history, to go back there and look at what was happening. But again, you have a thing that I have a personal interest in, is kind of how we determine our ideas and where do our ideas and thoughts even come from. And so often they're influenced by the media. And so many of these artists in the 70s and 80s were kind of taking on the media and taking on this idea that you know, the media might have an agenda, the media might have a position, the media might not be you know, this unbiased thing. And actually, we should look at that and we should examine that, because if we're not questioning the things that we're told, then we just become complicit robots in society and just, you know, nod our way through whatever we are told. And I think that the artists of that time were instrumental in raising questions around what the media was doing, what the media's questions are.
And throwing off like shackles of expectation, right? Another artist would be Valley Export, who changed their name, and who changed her clothes, and, you know, took self-portraits in other genders and other characters before Cindy Sherman was doing that. And it reminded me, just chatting about this reminded me of a phrase that's been used around your work, the potential body. I think that's a really rich phrase. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that means within your work on embodied masculinity and gender?
Yeah, so my work sort of takes a position of interrogating the idea of a heteronormative masculinity, like what that is, what, you know, what we describe as a normative masculinity. And what I became interested in was that how does the body, what role does the body play in determining your gender? And this is not necessarily from a kind of transgender conversation, although that does feed into it. I wasn't necessarily making comments around that. It's not my own personal experience, for one thing. But the idea of a transitional body that could either enforce some idea of a traditional masculinity, or it could also kind of push back at that idea of a traditional masculinity. So I spend a lot of time researching extreme male bodybuilding and seeing, you know, what that does to someone's idea of what masculinity might be. Because what's really fascinating about extreme male bodybuilding is you get to this point where you're just a sex object. Your body is the bodybuilder's body is just an object. And the work that I was making was quite often looking at the way those bodies were represented, which were in classic objectification ways, in a way that was normally reserved for women, right? But what's also especially interesting, these bodies are on display to other heterosexual men, really speaking. That's what they're for. It's for other men to look at and aspire to, but they're also this sexualized, they're also being sexualized in this interesting way. So that kind of, yeah, that's spin on kind of gender and sexuality, because it's really interesting for me to kind of think about and try and make artwork within that context. So the kind of potential body is this ever-changing thing, really.
I'd love to bring Jack and Nathan in for a group chat now, if that's okay, and just talk a little bit more about the body, characterization. I think all of you as artists, as creative practitioners, kind of play with roles in your work, which is really interesting. Just in terms of, before I forget, maybe we could just talk about presentation a little bit and kind of how to look at things, because I know that Nathan wants to show his work in the First Light exhibition on a microfilm reader. Nathan, tell us more about that and how that experience will be.
Yeah, so obviously the whole project kind of comes full circle, really. You know, I kind of began, scrolling through microfilm on the microfilm reader in the archives in the library, and it kind of just, I don't know, it kind of brought it all to life for me. And, you know, having the people at the exhibition who will come and kind of do the same thing, it just kind of brings it all together, really. And them getting that kind of hands-on approach that I had in the beginning was really, you know, interesting. And that whole kind of idea of making something new and taking it back and making it into older technology is always just so interesting to me. And yeah, I'm really glad that I was able to do that.
And we'll all have that same experience, and we'll be able to like be in your shoes and pretend that we're in the archive.
Yeah.
What do you think of what Brian was saying about his own work, Nathan, and also, you know, these gender roles, characters, people, voices that are that we all kind of play out in our heads, and yeah, this kind of character or role playing in your own work.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to my own work, obviously. It is kind of playing a character, I suppose, you know, especially in this kind of scenario, you're playing lots of different characters, especially when you're kind of creating this whole narrative on your own, loosely based off real events. It's obviously, it wasn't just the images as well, it was also the text and the whole narrative around that. And kind of trying to get into that kind of bubble of writing, especially when I'm not a particularly interesting writer. I'm not very good at it.
I'm sure that's not true, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a professional, but obviously trying to get into those kind of shoes and their mindset of what that would have been like is obviously really interesting to me, especially since I'm really interested in history and kind of people's perception of society. So that was really interesting.
I think also what's interesting about your work and Brian's work is that you've both in your own ways moved away slightly from traditional ideas of photography. Brian, you work with latex
Yeah,
and sculpture and
I haven't
other
taken a
materials.
photograph in about 5 years, but that was a kind of quite a deliberate decision for me to move away from photography. It was actually based around kind of struggling with representation, and I worked with a group of people. I used to be a kind of documentary photographer, really, and I was kind of really struggling to represent this group of people that I had been working with for quite a significant period of time, and that, amongst a few other things, just got me to move away from it a little bit. Yeah, but now, yeah, I spend my time stretching latex and spray painting it, and doing all sorts of much more physical based things, actually, and that's sort of part of it, really, is that there's a physical kind of component to the things that I make. Yeah.
Would Nathan say that there's a physicality to photo montage? I know that you use digital processes, Nathan, but it seems to me you're also making similar moves. You're pushing the boundaries of what maybe some of the audience might think of as traditional photography.
Yeah, and that's always something that I kind of struggled with, obviously, in my own practice, going and doing a photography course. You kind of have this perception of what it's going to be like. And it's not always that straightforward. And I kind of tried not to second guess myself and trying to put myself in any kind of category of what my work is. But obviously in the beginning, I kind of thought, well, is this really photography anymore? But it is in a way, because, photography is art, and everything you do is a kind of art form. And this was no different, really. And I always kind of thought, well, as long as it's something I enjoy, and I want to continue doing, then I shouldn't really define it by what it is or isn't.
There's we can say about all art, right, that it's autobiographical. We can certainly say that about photography. And I was reading about David Hockney's photographs in the 1980s today, and how he used to put himself literally in the frame, a little part of himself, like a shoe or a shadow or a hand. And it was making me think about writing as autobiography, and Jack's role in all this. Jack, you said to us last week that you'd based the text on some real life experiences. I wonder if you could just talk to us about that, and the idea that writing maybe is all writing is autobiographical, even if it's criticism.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that everything you absorb is going to be included in what you write, like subconsciously. And obviously this topic hits close to home for me in general. So there is a lot of autobiographical stuff in here, but it's not only my own experiences, it's like shared experiences of people I know. Like, for example, when I talk, I mean, I've not read it yet, but I'm going to talk about the part where I mentioned, coming home on the bus and camping up. But obviously it's flipped from what actually happens. So, a lot of my friends talk about coming back from Pride and hiding flags in their bag while they're on the tube so that people don't, or like removing glitter and things like that. And it's just like this kind of sad sort of shared experience that people have. And it's not even only queer people. I think, anyone that wants to dress a little bit different, because of this sort of homophobia in our society, people sort of feel like they have to change what they wear because of the prejudgment. So it's just like, yeah, I think, and then everything you write is going to be take into account, your own experiences, really.
I can see Brian nodding vigorously there. I wonder if you want to jump in.
No, I was just thinking that, yeah, I think that everything, we are just a byproduct of all of the things that have ever happened to us, aren't we? So of course, when you work creatively, you would assume that those things are gonna come out as well. So even what you choose to read, what you choose to look at in terms of your inspiration, which will of course also inform the things that you do, then that also that's all just this little kind of mesh of things that comes together to make us, and whatever we make is a byproduct of that as well. That's all I was thinking. I assume, I haven't done very much writing, creative writing myself, but I assume, Jack, that is the same sort of process, and that you work with, that idea that you draw on previous experiences, but also your inspiration sort of melds in with that. Would that be true?
Yeah, I feel like it's the same with all art. It's like what you absorb, but also your own experiences. I think it is a subconscious thing. You know, I don't think you can help that. It's just kind of, it's whatever flows, really.
Yeah, I think the best things generally are the things that are like authored, you know, that your lived experience. I think personally, I think it always gets tricky when you start to try and take on an understanding of something else that isn't your own. That's not to say you can't have opinions on things, but it becomes a lot more problematic, I think.
I've found that, you know, speaking about other people's experiences, even if it's fiction, I find that quite hard. I mean, it just makes sense to write what you know, but obviously you can add in different elements that you find along the way.
Subjective voice is really difficult to insert into arts criticism, though. So I applaud you for trying a blend of nonfiction and fiction in your approach.
Mm-hmm.
I've found as I got older and as I write more and more, I think the more personal I am when I write, the more relatable my writing becomes. And there's that fear, isn't there, of, oh, is this too niche? Is this too specific? Is this just me? And as soon as you share that with other people, you realize
Yes.
loads of other people feel like that.
Yeah.
And that's the weird thing about writing and sharing anything personal or sensitive in your work, just as you and Nathan have both done. They're both very successful works in different ways, but you've managed to capture like this pathos and pain and make people listen and laugh and really understand another viewpoint, which is super powerful. And as Brian said, very, very difficult to achieve as artists.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the most difficult thing, isn't it, as an artist, to communicate clearly with an audience that doesn't know you, and you won't be there. You know, usually when Nathan hangs this work up, he probably won't be there to talk about it, the story, to talk about how it was made to the audience. It's got to speak for itself. It's so difficult.
And
so,
that's okay, isn't it, Laura? Like, it's okay that he's not there because you want there to be some interpretation also, you know.
Yes.
I think probably Nathan wants people to be a bit pissed off, right? And you know, maybe that would be an interesting thing to happen. It's like you get some real straight person coming and going, "What is this rubbish?" You know, like that. That's amazing. Let's hope that happens.
Nathan? Yeah, I mean, I hope they don't cause too much of a scene. But yeah, hopefully it does kind of have an impact on someone and it's not too controversial.
People should feel angry looking at this work and reading it, because it really should make them angry. We haven't got a perfect world and we haven't achieved true parity yet, have we? So we need to get angry and stay angry in a productive way to get things done, to get policies changed.
Yeah.
I would like to end our group chat there just for a second, if that's okay, and bring in Jack, because I think it would be brilliant if you did your live reading now, Jack, of In 2021.
For sure.
So just to let the audience know, this short text has been commissioned for the First Light publication, which will be launched on the 22nd of May alongside the exhibition at Warrington. So in your own time now, Jack, take it away.
What would you do if the roles were reversed? If being straight was stigmatized? Would you come out early to your parents? In the back of a bus? Being teased for being virginal becomes too much, so you stand up boldly in front of all the other lads and say, "I've done sex actually," to a sea of proud faces, and technically you're not lying because you did do it, just with a girl. Or maybe you'd wait until college, announcing it drunkenly to the fella with his hands all over you, seeing his disappointment through a vodka-induced fog, his gaze burning more than the drink in your hand. Perhaps you're forced into coming out because a coworker finds that your Twitter likes, which you thought only you could see, were ablaze with straight porn. In future, you'll just use Google. And then, to your surprise, the work done by people braver than you means that coming out is actually not as bad as you thought it would be. Your boys are supportive, the boss sends you a nice card, and mum says she always knew anyway because you favoured Hot Wheels over Bratz dolls. Years of suppressing your personality come out in one big belch. You scream at the Reds on telly. You no longer feel pressured toward a skinny fat decaf caramel iced macchiato with no cream. You're supposed to relish this. This was what your bygone brothers, sisters, and they thems threw bricks for, held underground coked up raves for, hushed and boarded up orgies for, died for, and you're not dying, so pipe down. The worst you were dealt was having to camp up on the bus home after a night out. The Dutch courage, which had been a shield for the night, fast wearing off. Your fight or flight response told you that getting home in one piece was favourable to feeling like yourself. But sod it. When you're ready, come out. Discover your real interests, desires, and goals. It's like stepping out of a car and breathing fresh mountain air after driving up from the city. Years of doubt and stifling your own creativity are washed downstream. A vast plain lies before you. Grinder in the autumn, perhaps a stable relationship in the spring. Suddenly, the life ahead isn't so daunting. There's time. There will always be time.
Woo! Well done, Jack. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Very well read as well. I can tell that you got some acting chops. We've got comments as well. Superb reading. Everybody loved that. Thank you so much. I'm going to jump to the audience questions now, so you can ask anything you like to Jack, Nathan, or Brian. First one's for you, Nathan. How are you moving on further with this theme into your next project?
Yeah, so my next project that I'm working on during my MA is kind of a continuation of this kind of theme of LGBT history and archive, but this time it's going to be more our personal archives instead of, newspaper articles. It's going to be more like personal family photographs. It's kind of answering the question of, are we a product of our environment growing up? Would LGBT influences in our childhood have an impact on how we form our social and political opinions in the future? Also, how do family photo albums kind of influence our perception of what it means to be a family, how it kind of influences heteronormative ideals? So yeah, it's going to be very similar in terms of that whole question regarding LGBT place in society. So yeah, it's going to be very similar in a way, but also quite different.
Sounds really expansive though as well, and also bringing in like the personal family album type approach. How are you going to work on this, like in terms of techniques and processes? Are you still enamored with photo montage, or are you going to be bringing in other things?
So it's going to be photo montage again.
Good, because you're great at it.
And so it's basically more darkroom focused now, so film photography. So I've already kind of started this already. It's kind of scanning in family photo albums and photographs and digitizing them, editing them to incorporate, very similar to this project, incorporate kind of queer imagery, in those family photographs, kind of in those mundane, everyday kind of environment photographs that we're kind of used to when we view those photographs as a family. And kind of, queer, the kind of image is something that I'm very interested in, and I'm going to then have those images turned back into film negatives that I'm going to print in the darkroom.
Wow, that's brilliant. Have you done that before? Have you worked before with it?
No, I haven't. So it's very similar to obviously me turning my digital files into microfilm to view on the microfilm reader. Yes. It's that kind of taking the new and changing it and kind of taking it back to the old, because obviously nowadays, especially in those kind of older formats, people are so quick to move on to the newest thing that we kind of forget the things we leave behind. So it's kind of going back to that, really.
But each approach has a completely different texture, atmosphere, right? And you can do different things, like you bring in the microfilm reader into the exhibition later on in the month. That lovely tactile kind of way of viewing things. It's so different to projecting images onto a wall or printing them off or framing them. I think that's really important to keep other kind of like analog technologies alive and mix, as you've been doing, with new tech, new methods of printing.
Yeah.
Got another question for you, Nathan. Sorry, quick on to the next one. With programs like It's a Sin, there seems to be a positive shift in how mainstream media is treating the history of gay culture in the UK. Do you feel like your work is part of a larger movement?
I think so. I mean, I don't think my work is, completely separate from that kind of ideal of kind of bringing LGBT history into the forefront of society, because obviously for so long it was pushed to the side and, like held back. But yeah, I don't think it's something that's completely separate, from programs such as, It's a Sin or things like that, because it's kind of bringing those stories back to the kind of forefront of society again. And I think the more LGBT influences we have, both in the modern day and through history, is obviously really important.
Got another question. Did you have any ideas that you felt went too far? Did you have any worries about tackling such sensitive topics in your work? I suppose that's a nod to how naughty some of your work is.
Yeah. So I think it was hard to begin with. I think when you're starting something, it's always kind of complicated how you're going to expand on that, especially the first few times when I was doing the editing and things like that. I never wanted to kind of go too far where, obviously back then I had no idea that people would be viewing my work in such a way that, it would have such a public platform. So I kind of just thought it was going to be between myself and my tutor. So obviously I was a bit more open than I probably would have been if I had known.
But I'm glad you did.
I was trying to push him to go as extreme as possible. I remember that having a tutorial with him, just go all out, just don't be afraid, And
yes,
like I was saying before, you want a reaction, there's nothing worse than being down the middle as an artist. You don't want to be forgettable. You'd rather be hated than forgotten, that's that's how I approach things.
It's got to be memorable, hasn't it? And I think that's what's so exciting about Nathan's work, in photo montage. He's taken a process that's got a long history in activism and protest, like Linda, like Kruger and others who've paved the way. And it's just a gut punch. It's just so memorable and funny and brilliant, and it has a clear message that everyone can understand. And I can't wait to see it in situ in the gallery, Nathan. Thank you so much for answering those questions, and thank you to my other two guests, Jack Ryder and Brian Morrison. Thank you, guys. You were brilliant, very generous with your time too. Well done, Jack, on the reading.
Very well hosted, Laura, as well. Excellent. Really good.
I'll give you that $5 later, Brian. And thanks to Natalie at Open Eye Gallery for facilitating, of course, as always. Natalie, you've been brilliant. Thanks to Waterside Trafford, Castlefield Gallery's new art spaces, and all of the First Light supporters, and of course all of you for watching. And I know we've had some regular viewers for these talks who keep turning up to every single First Light spotlight, so thank you. We do appreciate you spending your evenings with us. But it's not over yet. Our next First Light spotlight, is on Tuesday 25th of May, and it's called Things Are Strange. A hallucinogenic smear, lockdown brain, of unnaturally bright daisies, a blurred impression of a house reflected in mercury-like material. The photographs of Dan Commons play between reality and our perception of it. So that's what we'll be discussing next time with your host, Mario Popham, who will be joined by Dan and his tutor, Phil Weldon from Leeds Arts University, and writer Jack Hook from Liverpool John Moores University, who will be reading a new text responding to Dan's work. So do join us for that on the 25th. Until then, thank you all, good night, and stay safe. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.